We're back! It is week 1 of the 2020 NFL season, and we are live with the Heat Check Fantasy Podcast, getting you set for the main slate of games on Sunday over on FanDuel. And if you're listening on the podcast side, yes, we have ourselves a new intro as well. New season, new intro. Same bad old takes right here on the Heat Check Fantasy Podcast. Welcome on into the Heat Check Fantasy Podcast, powered by numberFire. That's right here on the FanDuel Podcast Network and numberFire.com. My name is Jim Sonis. I am a senior writer and analyst for numberFire.com, joined here as always by Brandon Gadula. He is the managing editor for numberFire. Brandon, happy opening day to you. How you doing?
Yeah, I just want to be the first one to say that I'm excited for football to be back.
No one else has said this. There's not been. I sent out a GIF with Adam Gase sniffing smelling salts because it's a weird GIF that I love, and that was the same formula of 75 different tweets I saw this morning. It was 4 words about the NFL being back and then a GIF. So I am happy to be very much a sheep when it comes to Twitter.
Yeah, I mean, we're all excited. I'm never really on Twitter enough, but I just kind of
for the best
checked it today, and I mean, football is back. Football, all caps football. I've learned a lot about the NFL schedule today.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But we are ready for week number 1. And with week number 1 comes a lot of interesting challenges always, but especially for this week, because we don't really know what various roles are going to look like. We don't know what rookies are going to play, what snap rates. We don't know who's playing at the first team offense. There's also, there's just COVID stuff to deal with. So there is a lot of uncertainty. So we're going to break that down throughout the podcast for today. If you are a new listener, our format for this podcast is we're going to be going through a slate overview, kind of asking the big questions about this slate. We'll take a look at some injuries impacting the main slate, aka Mike Evans. Brandon and I will both go through a couple of trends, focusing a lot on week number 1, past history of week 1s, talking about that first for trends. We'll also go through some games that are interesting from a bookmaking perspective because that plays a heavy role in DFS. We'll talk about weather, and of course, we'll go position by position at the end of the podcast to give our favorite plays of the slate. And we do this twice per week during NFL season, not just on Thursday with the preview podcast, but also on Monday with our weekly recap, talking about snap rates, usages, roles, and we'll play Name That Salary as well. So make sure you are subscribed to the numberFire Daily Fantasy Podcast feed wherever you get your podcasts. Put that up there right away on Monday morning. We'll also be recording it live on YouTube at 9 a.m. So if you want your information a little bit earlier, make sure you subscribe to the FanDuel YouTube page as well. We're going to do a snake draft live on air on Friday with JJ Zacharyson and me and Brandon. That'll be Friday at 3:30 p.m. on the FanDuel YouTube, Twitch, and Facebook pages. So to save yourself the hassle, subscribe to the YouTube page and make sure you check out all the good stuff we got going on for this NFL season. But for now, let's dive into week number 1 and preview what's cooking for this week. And to me, I think there are 2 main questions that I have entering the slate. The 2 key defining things when it comes to lineup building for me. The first one is we've got players in new roles, and we have to decide which value plays we want to trust. And when I say trust, I don't mean I think they will get 10 carries and 3 targets. I mean, can I trust that they will get enough usage to put up a big FanDuel score? Because you're not going to be in a perfect lineup with 15 points, most likely. You need to have a path to upside in order to be justifiable from a DFS perspective. So that's question number 1. Question number 2 is which games do I stack? We have 5 games here with a total of 47 or higher. 3 of those games have spreads of less than 4 points, which means we have game stacking opportunities. We'll have to decide which ones are the best. I have a personal favorite, but it may be stupid, so we'll talk through that later on. Brandon, what are the keys influencing you for this week? What are the main questions you're asking yourself before filling out lineups?
Well, we'll talk about this a lot, specifically on this podcast, but throughout the season. We, on this podcast, pay up for running back, so I'm very curious to see what a lot of these running back situations look like. We need snaps. We need certainty at running back on FanDuel, and I went through trying to figure out of all of the main slate teams, how many teams had a true workhorse back. I counted about 8. I asked Jim to do the same. He came up with around 8 as well. That's not a lot. It sounds limiting, but we'll talk about why that's really important in just a bit. But I want to see like what Antonio Gibson's role looks like. What about Buffalo with Zach Moss and Devin Singletary? Even someone like Le'Veon Bell, I think we can learn a lot about in week 1. I recommended Le'Veon Bell a lot last year because of snaps and just workload. I don't know how that's going to look this year. But another big thing I'm looking for is the first read on these new look passing offenses. Obviously, Tampa Bay, but that might not be super clear with the Mike Evans situation. But Joe Burrow with some pretty strong receiving weapons. Derek Carr with a lot of new toys to play with. Teddy Bridgewater in Carolina. So I'm going to try to like kind of overreact to what I see because I'm fine giving up on the notions that I had entering the season based on just nothing, no preseason, just some reporting. So what I see in week 1, I think, is going to dictate a lot of how I play out the next few weeks.
And I think it's important, too, to also divorce ourselves from what we saw last year if situations are different, because I think this is especially relevant for someone like for that you talked about Teddy Bridgewater. I think it's important for him and also Derek Carr because they're in very different contexts, and context matters so much for quarterback. That's how Jared Goff can go from being lost to being a top 10 quarterback in 1 year, is because the situation changed drastically. And the situation for Derek Carr when he's throwing to Henry Ruggs, Bryan Edwards, and Darren Waller is a lot different than Tyrell Williams and
Hunter
whatever else. Yeah, well, he'll still be out there.
Yeah, but I mean...
Well,
last year we saw Hunter Renfrow kind of make Darren Waller a little bit of a non-factor, so I don't know how that's going to work this year.
And so I think the key is to decipher which situations have changed and how you want to handle them based on that. And that's tough. It means you have to make assumptions, you have to take risks, but we're going to be doing that for today. So let's dive into some injuries impacting this week 1 main slate. Mike Evans is the big one. He missed practice on Wednesday with a hamstring injury. Bruce Arians said that Evans is day-to-day and will likely be a game-time call on Sunday. We're going to talk more about that game in the bookmaker section. The Vikings will face the Packers without stud defensive end Danielle Hunter, who is on injured reserve with a neck injury. The Vikings did just acquire Yannick Ngakoue, but this is a big loss. I mean, Danielle Hunter is one of the best defensive linemen in football. So with Hunter being out, Brandon, does anybody on this Packers offense pique your interest?
So I'll talk about like how I kind of value players each week. I have core plays, which are players I kind of would put in a single lineup if I'm building one lineup. Secondary plays, who I'm kind of higher on than just like tournament darts, but then also just like tournament plays. I have Devonte Adams as a secondary play mostly because of his salary at $8,000. Obviously, it's very easy to love Devonte Adams, but he's wide receivers at that salary don't really fit my single lineup. So for that reason, I have him as a secondary play, but I have a lot of interest in him. But outside of that, I don't know what the backfield's going to look like. I'm fine missing out on Aaron Rodgers in what shouldn't really be an eruption spot. So I think it's just Devonte for me, really. What about you?
I like Devonte a lot. Among the high salaried receivers, he's my favorite. We'll talk about that in our player picks. But among the high salaried receivers, and I'll get there at times because there's value elsewhere, I think Devonte is number 1 for me. I think that, like, I don't know how many lineups I would need to get to Marquez Valdes-Scantling, but the camp reports on him have been very positive, and he is one of those value receivers who could be very interesting. He's $4,700. We've got Alan Lazard, who is in the 5,000s as well. So I wouldn't hate taking runs at them because the Vikings secondary has the potential to struggle early in the season because they've got a lot of young guys out there. So I think all the receivers are kind of in play, but I would agree with Devonte being like a secondary type play, like very high, someone like I would prioritize if I had the salary. And I would say Valdes-Scantling is number 2 here. Probably someone I like try to get, like, if I can get to 10% or so on Valdes-Scantling, I could live with that. And then maybe some throws at Lazard. But it's mostly about Devonte for me here as well. One of the potential value backfields could be in Jacksonville because Leonard Fournette was released. Raquel Armstead is on the COVID-19 list. Divine Ozigbo is placed on injured reserve this morning with a hamstring injury. That leaves Chris Thompson, James Robinson, Dario Gumbawale, and maybe Laviska Shenault in the backfield. But it's also expected to be a pretty hideous offense. I don't have a ton of faith personally in Gardner Minshew. So, Brandon, is there enough upside for you to take any stabs at this Jaguars backfield?
No, not as a team that's most likely going to lose. And really, I think if anyone leads this backfield, they're not going to play a ton of snaps. And I'll talk about why I'm not really interested in running backs without a lot of snaps.
I think that Chenault is interesting at $4,600 because we saw last year the value of carries for wide receivers via Deebo Samuel. And like Laviska Chenault is kind of in a similar mold to Deebo Samuel, where he's like a running back who allegedly plays receiver. But like if he can get a couple of carries, that actually does move the needle a bit for him from an expected point perspective. So I think that Chenault at $4,600 worthy of consideration for me.
What are your thoughts on him as like a straight receiver, like target projection wise?
I mean, I don't know, but like that's the point. Like, how many guys on that team are you projecting for significant targets? It's DJ Chark, right? Like, there is a lot of ambiguity in that system. Also, Jay Gruden likes to throw the ball, so that definitely helps things. And if I'm going to take a shot on a lower salary player, I'd rather do it at wide receiver than running back. So yes. I think that Chenault at $4,600 is interesting for me. I mentioned Marquez Valdes-Scantling. I would probably put Chenault a little bit higher than Valdes-Scantling just because there's more ambiguity around his role, which is a good thing for me.
Yeah, I was just curious. I just don't really love the idea, even early on, taking on too much risk. And I think that's kind of what Chenault is for me right now. So I was curious to hear your thoughts.
I think everyone's risky, so I'm actually pretty okay with risk. That's counter. So I guess the running back discussion is different because it's not about risk; it's about upside with them. With everyone else, it's about risk. So like I'm saying, I'm okay with risk while saying spend up at running back. That may sound counterthetical. Is that a word? Counterintuitive, whatever. I don't know. Counterthetical is a new word. We're gonna go with that. Counterintuitive, but it's not the risk at running back. It's the upside that pushes me away. So I'm okay with risk everywhere else.
Yeah, I mean every wide receiver who plays a few snaps has upside because every wide receiver can kind of like break an 80-yard touchdown.
Except for Danny Amendola.
But that's just not how points are really accumulated at running back. So
yeah,
that's kind of where I'm coming from too. So
okay. The Eagles had both Jalen Reagor and Miles Sanders at practice in a limited fashion on Wednesday. Reagor is expected to miss this game, I would think, but Sanders could play. Doug Peterson did say that they may limit Sanders' snaps early as he comes back from a hamstring injury. So Brandon, we like Sanders from a season-long perspective, or at least I do, and I like this offense against Washington. I like his role that he had last year. But is there enough juice there if he's limited for you to roll him out against Washington?
It's so tough because we don't know what limit means. Right. Philly could dominate this game. They could not, obviously. You don't know for sure. But I think for me, Sanders has to be at best a secondary play because I am going to want to spend up a lot at running back. But I like Kenyon Drake at $6,600. So I don't think I have to play Miles Sanders. Whereas, before any health concerns, I felt like maybe I'd have to play Miles Sanders and just kind of eat the chalk.
If he gets into full practice Friday, I'll bump him up. But I think even then, he'd still be like a secondary play for me, just because.
When the coach says they're going to like limit your touches, that's absolutely what we don't want in DFS.
Right. Yes, exactly. Coaches tend to be overly optimistic when it comes to players, except for John Gruden, who kind of hinted that Henry Ruggs just won't play. But that's not accurate. So coaches tend to be overly optimistic. If they're saying they're going to limit you, we should take that into account. The 49ers without Deebo Samuel and Brandon Ayuk in practice on Wednesday. If they miss, it sounds like Dante Pettis and Kendrick Bourne would start. All right. We'll talk more about them in the section on bookmakers. Mike Williams was able to get in a limited practice for the Chargers, meaning he may be able to suit up for their matchup with the Bengals. Do you have any interest in this Chargers offense, Brandon?
I do like Keenan Allen. I think he's easy to project for volume. I kind of like Austin Eckler, especially if we find out that he's not going to be sort of a go-to running back. His salary is $7,700, and I never really hate Hunter Henry at tight end just because he can be involved. He has some downfield usage, so I'm not going to go over like overly hard at this offense, but I do kind of like this game as a sneakier game stack.
Yeah. I don't know if I want it as a game stack necessarily, but I think I agree with you where like the Chargers do kind of interest me. I'm not really in on Keenan Allen because like there are a lot of receivers in that range who I like, and it's not that I dislike him, it's just that I like him less than those other guys. Like Tyler Lockett, DK Metcalf, like give me that. And especially with Tyrod Taylor being the quarterback, it does lower me a bit on those guys. Looking back to the last year, let me see if I actually have this note. Oh my gosh, I should have pulled this up beforehand. Oh my gosh, we're scrambling. Week 1, baby.
There he goes.
There we go. Okay. So Tyrod Taylor in 2017 had an 18.3% deep rate. He averaged 0.27 passing net expected points per attempt on deep passes. Phillip Rivers had a 21% deep rate last year and 0.43 passing net expected points per dropback. So having Taylor lowers, I would expect, the average depth of target within this team and does lower the effectiveness on deep balls. So that hurts Mike Williams, Hunter Henry, Keenan Allen. But I think that Eckler is still a good play. He's not in my top 3 at running back for this week, especially once you consider his salary, because I like Chris Carson more, who is a little bit cheaper. But I think that Eckler is in that second tier running back. Is that where you're putting him to?
Yeah, what always happens whenever we go through a podcast is we kind of whittle it down to like 4, maybe 5 running backs who we would consider in like a single cash game lineup or like a single entry sort of vibe. So yeah, it's like, obviously not obviously, it's not obvious yet, but I like Chris Carson more than Austin Eckler, but I can't just say I'm not going to play Austin Eckler at all because I like Chris Carson more. So he's more of a secondary play, a bit of a differentiation piece. I'll have to check the fan share tags closer to kickoff to see where Eckler is, but I would imagine not super high.
He's high enough right now. He's higher than Carson somehow.
Well,
but it's early, so there's not a ton of tags in yet because people are still ramping things up, but I would say that Eckler is ahead of Carson. I also don't want to like blow their entire operation, but Eckler is higher than Carson. We're going to talk why we like Chris Carson in just a second in the trend section. But first, what if I told you that you had the chance to earn a free subscription to numberFire Premium? Is that something you would be interested in? Good question. The numberFire Listener League is back, and this year we are awarding FanDuel bonus cash in addition to 1 free numberFire premium subscription to users during every week of the 2020 NFL season. All you have to do is enter and finish in the top 10 to win bonus cash, and the first place user will win a premium subscription, a $120 value, because again, premium's cheaper this year, but hey, I take $120 personally. So what are you waiting for? Don't miss your chance to become a premium member at no cost. To enter, visit FanDuel.com/league/podcast. That's FanDuel.com/league/podcast. Eligibility restrictions apply. Let's dive into our trends discussion here for week number 1, starting off with you, Brandon, and this is the key talking point for week 1. We've got running backs who, in theory, from a point per dollar of salary perspective, are probably going to be values. But we need to know if they have enough juice to actually be good at FanDuel plays. So you're going to look at this by checking out snap rate. What do we need to know there?
So, there are a ton of committees entering week 1, really this season in general. And I can't lie, the idea of saving salary for a running back always feels enticing on FanDuel. If you can get, for nearly minimum salary, a running back who is going to start and play the majority of snaps. But I feel like sometimes it's always hard to know for sure. But again, on this podcast, we pay up for running backs, and I just wanted to revisit things and see what the data says, if that's still the correct way to play it. So I'm going to talk about like percentages of bigger games from running backs that come from like non-workhorses. So I grabbed game logs for every game since 2016 in which a running back was projected for at least 3 fantasy points on numberFire. The straight up correlation between a player's single game snap rate and his corresponding FanDuel points was 0.6. It's quite a strong correlation. They range from 0 to 1, 1 being a perfect correlation. So again, if you just know someone's snap rate, you're going to have a good chance over a large sample of knowing what, his FanDuel point output range is going to be. For something a little bit more tangible, I bucketed every running back into their snap rate for a single game. And running backs who played at least 95% of the snaps since 2016 averaged 19.5 FanDuel points, which shouldn't really surprise us. It's basically Christian McCaffrey and a few others sprinkled in. But I went ahead and bucketed everyone from 95 plus, 85 to 95% of snaps, 75 to 85% of snaps. So basically just go down in tiers in your mind. And the reason I did this is because you'll see the drop off. So again, 19.5 FanDuel points for running backs who played at least 95% of the snaps in a game. Then for 85 to 95, it's 18.1, 17.3, 14.9, 12.9, 10.3, 8.1. So you can see how quickly that drops off. So again, 55 to 65% of the snaps, those guys average 12.9 FanDuel points. 45 to 55, so those guys who were right around half the snaps, in general, from 2016 on, 10.3 FanDuel points per game. So that's kind of what you're looking at. And obviously there are going to be outliers, but again, if you have nothing else to go off of, snap rate matters a ton for running backs over a large sample. And of course, it's not that running backs can't have big games on limited snaps, but it's super rare. The average snap rate for a running back with at least 15 FanDuel points in a game is 66.8. So you might be saying, guess what? Antonio Gibson doesn't really need 15 FanDuel points at his salary, but if you make the cutoff 10 FanDuel points, the average snap rate for those backs is 61.6%. And if you stick with that 10-point cutoff, 29% of running back games since 2016 with at least 10 FanDuel points came when a back played fewer than half the snaps. So you have a 3 in 10 shot each week that a 10-point scorer was on the field for less than half of his team snaps. So with all of these situations where I don't know what Antonio Gibson's snap rate is going to be. If it could be 65%, it could be 75%, it could be 48%. And if it's 48% in general, that's not necessarily enough to get me to bite. I feel a lot better about someone like Christian McCaffrey or Chris Carson or Dalvin Cook. And I know the salaries are different, but this is super important on FanDuel. Of the 446 10-point games from backs under 50% of the snaps, they pretty much have to score. They average 10 carries and 3 targets, which is around 16 or 17 adjusted opportunities, which we'll talk about in a second. But here's the driving point for me as well. Running backs with an average or with a salary of 7,000 or more on FanDuel average 15.8 FanDuel points per game, and wide receivers at the same price and up average 12.9. It's a pretty big gap. It just basically means more often than not, the pricier running backs, the guys with the higher salaries, are better plays than the high salary wide receivers on FanDuel. And that's why each and every week throughout the season, I'm going to say, I'm going to pay up at running back, even though I love the high priced wide receivers, the high salaried wide receivers. It's just the way that it makes the most sense to work on FanDuel. So, Jim, am I being a donkey for avoiding value backs and paying a high salary for the top tier backs in week 1?
So my default tournament lineup right now includes 0 running backs with a salary lower than $7,200, 72 or 73. What's Chris Carson's salary? $7,200. So no, I don't think you're a donkey because I have the same mindset. It's not about floor. It's about ceiling. And if I'm going to put a player in my tournament lineup, they need a path to 20 FanDuel points. And even that's a low number. You can do well if a running back gets you 12 points, but you get a lot more wiggle room if they score 20. So yeah. I'm worried about ceiling, and that's why listening to your discussion I think is really important because you do need – it's hard to score fantasy points from the sideline, and that's why snap rate matters a lot. The one potential reason that I am okay taking swipes at someone specifically like Antonio Gibson is because if they're getting high leverage touches – I don't care as much about their snap rate. That was Aaron Jones last year. When Devonte Adams is out, he was getting targets. He was also getting every touch near the goal line. So I was okay with a more limited role in that situation because I knew that every touch he had additional juice. If Antonio Gibson's going to get creative touches from Scott Turner, then there is more of a path to upside there. So, and especially if it skews more towards targets than carries, that's another reason why I would be looking at that. So I think that's why Gibson is kind of the one exception. And if I have one lineup, if I'm doing a single entry lineup, Antonio Gibson will not be in that lineup, nor will any of the true value backs. Like I would consider Miles Sanders and Kenyon Drake at 68 and 66, but it's hard to go below that. If I have a single entry lineup, I am jamming in high salary backs, taking chances on the low salaried wide receivers, because I can do that on this slate. I know I can do so. So I agree with you. We're on the same page here. I'm just a little bit more willing to go with Gibson specifically because I think that he has a good chance to get some really money opportunities.
Yeah, and the receiving is super important, which we'll talk about in a second. But another thing to keep in mind is, so you say, like, so what if someone is almost minimum salary? He doesn't need 20 FanDuel points. He opens up a lot for me to. Well, if you play someone at 4,600 and they score 12 FanDuel points, if you're playing a tournament, you have to then hit on every other player because
you're making like an 8-player parlay effectively.
Yeah, you're basically saying, well, this guy's, and again, Antonio Gibson's a little bit of a different story, but just in general, whenever we see these situations throughout the year, think if this person's ceiling is like 12 FanDuel points, if they get like 60 yards on the ground and a touchdown or something, you have to hit everywhere else. You're taking away the shot that you get one player who can just erupt for like 40 FanDuel points and basically help you win or help you place in the top 10. So that's another thing to keep in mind is you really have to, by spending down, and regardless of what position it is, if it's someone who just doesn't have a ceiling and you're playing that person in a tournament, even in a cash game, like you're really saying, no, I'm comfortable spending down because I'm going to hit everywhere else. And that's a little foolish.
And I think that the overall key here is the reason we're hesitant with low salaried backs is not floor, it's because of ceiling. And I think that's the main takeaway for me, at least, in this discussion. Yeah. Let's talk about running backs a little bit more here with my first trend. And one of the keys for me is pinpointing each player's most relevant sample. That is a 3-word phrase you'll hear from me a lot throughout the season, trying to find each player's most relevant sample. By that, I mean what they've done in the contexts that are similar to what they've got this week. So, for example, how much work does Chris Carson get when Rashad Penny is out? How much work does Nick Chubb get when Kareem Hunt is active? That is always going to be more relevant than season-long numbers, despite the fact you're dabbling with smaller samples. Some players are not going to have relevant samples this year because the team has brought in new pieces or they're on new teams. Like Kerryon Johnson, you throw out all the data because it doesn't matter. But a good number of these backs are in situations similar to what they've had in the past. So I went through all the guys who had that on this slate and tried to select the most relevant sample for each running back who was in a semi-similar situation. Then I looked at the carries and targets that they got in that sample. I then doubled the targets to give me adjusted opportunities. That's another phrase we'll use a lot here on the podcast. Adjusted opportunities. If you're new to the podcast, we doubled the target total because targets are worth twice as much as carries on half PPR sites like FanDuel. And it made a couple of plays stand out here. Not shockingly, Christian McCaffrey leads the slate with 33.6 adjusted opportunities per game. This was before Carolina started selling out to get him the records. So it's actually the first half of the season. 33.6 adjusted opportunities per game. He is $10,000. He is very worth it. That is not a shock. Dalvin Cook was second at 29.6 adjusted opportunities. He's $8,700, but he is at home. He is facing a Packers defense that cannot stop the run. And I think that both those guys are elite level plays. Third on that list was Chris Carson, the guy we've alluded to a couple of times. He is just $7,200. I think that is way too low salaried. Carson averaged 27.7 adjusted opportunities per game when Rashad Penny was out or limited last year. And that's a huge number. He's also a slight road favorite in a game with a 49.5-point total. Last year, when we looked at perfect lineups, there were a large majority of running backs who came from games with projected tight spreads. Chris Carson, Dalvin Cook, Christian McCaffrey all fit in that exact same bucket. And I think that I kind of want to get all three of them in the same lineup and ignore the lower salaried backs. It's a really fun build, and you can make it work with all the value at wide receiver and at quarterback for this week. Other guys who did pop in this method were Joe Mixon at $7,300, Miles Sanders at $68. Again, the caveat that things can be different for him with the injury. Kenyon Drake at $6,600. Josh Jacobs, I would note, doesn't really have a most relevant sample because he got hurt pretty early in the season, and it sounds like he may get additional passing game work. So I included him in this, and he didn't grade out well, but I'm acknowledging that his workload could go up this year. So we have guys like Mixon, Sanders, and Drake facing elite defensive lines, and Sanders may be limited, but the workloads for those guys are really good. So the big takeaway for me is that McCaffrey, Dalvin, and Carson are all priorities on Sunday. How are you feeling about those guys and the higher salaried running backs in general from a ranking perspective?
Yeah, those are the three who stand out to me, which sounds a little boring potentially, but I think based on projected workload and situations, they're just the best three running backs on the board. I do like Joe Mixon plenty, just because of what we saw from him late last year. I'll talk about him in player picks, but I mean, it really is kind of that simple. If you're looking for opportunities through the air, snaps, goal line work, that's what leads to these huge games from running backs. There are, of course, a few where, Austin Eckler, years ago would house an 80-yard screen pass and, be a high scorer, but this is just where this is where ceiling comes from. And so I think those three are the correct three to rank at the top, especially with Alvin Kamara a little bit uncertain. Tampa Bay is always not. Was not a matchup that you wanted to target running backs against last year. I'm going to take a little bit of a wait and see approach on Josh Jacobs in terms of the pass game work, but I am intrigued in terms of tournaments. Aaron Jones is always my mortal enemy for DFS, but I mean, really, if you whittle it down, I think those are the three running backs who have the least amount of concerns for week one.
I agree. I want to talk briefly about the target thing you discussed. You don't get a lot of running backs in perfect lineups with no targets. If you look back at last year, there were 65 or 45. I don't know, whatever. Math. Ooh, tough. Oh gosh, this hurts. 45 running backs in perfect lineups. 2 of them made it with 0 receptions. 10 of them made it with fewer than 3 receptions. So unless you're getting like 200 yards and a tutty out of Derrick Henry, like he's not on the main slate, but like that type of situation, you need catches, and these are the guys I expect to get them. I'm higher on Jacobs than I think you are based on that because he's got a tremendous matchup, and I think there is the potential for him to get passing game work, but he's not in that same tier for me as Carson, McCaffrey, and Cook. Let's move on to your second trend and talk about totals, because this is a weird week. We don't have any preseason to go off of. And also, teams have not played in the preseason, which could lead to some concern about coordination, chemistry, etc. Your trend is focusing on what we've seen in the past with those types of situations. What did you find when you dug into the data?
Yeah, so I wanted to stick with another league-wide trend. Usually we do more team-specific stuff, but it's a little bit harder entering this year more than any others. But I kind of wanted to look at week one and see how that fares relative to other over-under projections throughout seasons. And also dig into 2011 when we had the lockout that reduced the preseason length and the reps that offenses and defenses had entering the season. It's the closest corollary that we have. But from 2012, so if you look past that, from 2012 through 2019, week one through week 16, the average NFL game, 47.5 or 45.7 points rather. The average over hit rate, 48.6%. That will vary based on your source, so don't yell at me if you have it a little bit different. But week ones, it's 46 points and a little bit over on the hit rate, 50.4% of the over, so a little bit more common to see an over in week ones. In 2011, the lockout season, games scored an average of 47 points, so a point higher than a typical week one since then, but 75% of them hit the over on the posted over-under. Of note, though, the highest total in week one in 2011 was 47 points. 12 of 16 games had posted totals below 43 points because I think the expectation was that scoring would be bad. That's not really what we see quite this year. Some totals have dropped, but still, even with the totals maybe being a little bit lower than what we have this year, all but one game scored 41 combined points. 4 of them hit 50. There was a 76-point game, a 62-point game. And those 15 games in that week one with 40-plus points were the most since 2000. Now, of course, only 4 hit 50, which is still not bad, but it's a little bit below the average since 2000. But what we saw in 2011 over the first 5 weeks were games scored about 3 points more on average than the season-long average, so that kind of adjusts for what a point combined points per games were based on this season. So a little bit more productive early on in 2011. So what we could see is some extra scoring early on. So from this, if we assume that it's at all helpful, I think we should be open to the idea that games with lower totals are still viable fantasy matchups to target. I think the games with the higher totals could still erupt. Again, we had 2 60-plus point games in 2011, but I think this gives extra weight to the non-obvious games on the slate. That I usually have that take for week ones anyway, but I'm really going to prioritize some of the games that people are just overlooking for tournament purposes. So what are your thoughts entering week one based on this shortened offseason? More that the offenses struggle, more that the defenses struggle? What are you thinking?
So we had Orlando Scandrick on our betting show covering the spread. He played cornerback for the Dallas Cowboys very briefly for the Eagles. And he said that communication was a big thing for defensive secondaries, and he thought that that might be something that would struggle or that teams would struggle with early in the year. And I think that's kind of what we saw in 2011 was communication in secondaries. So I think that it's not just that I expect scoring to be pretty high. I would also be pretty inclined to target secondaries that don't have a lot of experience together. Like the Vikings are playing a lot of young guys, which is why I like the Packers a decent amount. The Panthers are all new. The Raiders secondary is pretty new too. So I think I'm broadly in on games being pretty high scoring. And that's why I am okay keeping my default process. And again, for new listeners, my default process for NFL DFS for multi-entering in tournaments is building out game stacks and like having skeleton lineups where like I have Derek Carr paired with Henry Ruggs and then run it back with Christian McCaffrey. Derek Carr with Henry Ruggs, run it back with DJ Moore, et cetera, trying to get those combinations and building around those game stacks. I'm going to keep that strategy for this week. Brandon, I think you take a pretty similar approach. Are you going to be doing that for week one as well?
Yeah, I mean, you have to make assumptions, whether that is like Jim pretty much does is tell himself a narrative. And like if Christian McCaffrey goes off, there's going to have to be probably some passing volume for the Raiders. I mean, you can take a simulation-based route, but it all should point to like there being some correlations, especially because I always try to think of things from a tournament standpoint because I do. If you want to hit the high end and really have like a top 1 percentile lineup, or I guess 99th percentile 1% lineup, either way, you're going to see correlations, and the best way to kind of maximize that is if you just take a stand and think something's going to happen, because then if you hit one game right, you can hit 3 or 4 positions in your lineup correctly, as opposed to getting like one-offs and hitting all 9 correctly.
And one of the stands I want to make leads us into my second trend, which is looking at the Panthers and the Raiders game, because this main slate includes a couple games with obvious shootout potential, as Brandon alluded to, and people seem to be including the Raiders versus the Panthers in that, but I'm not sure they're high enough on this game, and I want to be pretty high on this one. The main reason I dig it is because of the defenses. The Raiders finished last year ranked 31st overall and 31st against the pass, according to numberFire's schedule-adjusted metrics. They have added guys there via free agency in the draft, but they're going to be young, especially in the secondary. And again, change is probably not a good thing early in the year, especially for a defensive secondary. But the Raiders won't be as young as the Panthers. They shed a bunch of defensive veterans in the offseason. They spent all 7 draft picks on defensive players, and they were already terrible against the rush. They were actually dead last there last year, but now they're probably going to be bad against the pass too. And these offenses have some fast, young, fun, electric players. The Raiders have added Henry Ruggs and Bryan Edwards in the draft. We have this perception that Derek Carr is a low upside passer. That was true last year, but with Ruggs and Edwards in town, he's effectively a different quarterback. Situation matters so much for quarterbacks, and Carr's situation now is very different than his situation last year. I think he's pretty fun at $7,100, and I'm very happy to pair him with anybody on this offense, including Josh Jacobs. Probably not Hunter Renfrow unless I hate myself enough on Sunday morning. As for the Panthers, their new offensive coordinator is Joe Brady. He was LSU's coordinator last year. Figures to have a pass-first, fast offense, and he has the tools to do that. Teddy Bridgewater, similar to Derek Carr, in that he's in a different quarterback situation than he was last year. His deep rate was not always low. Like, we made jokes about Teddy last year, but when Teddy was a starter at the Vikings in 2014 and 2015, his deep rate was league average. His sample with the Saints was just 196 pass attempts, so we'd probably be wise not to put too much weight on what we saw out of Teddy last year. I prefer a Carr between the two quarterbacks, but this might be, all things considered, my favorite game to stack on the slate. If I have a single entry lineup, I'm probably going to wind up building around this game. So, Brandon, am I dumb, or are you equally excited for Raiders versus Panthers?
I'm very excited for basically all the reasons you laid out. I know I said I'm taking a little bit of a wait-and-see approach on Josh Jacobs in terms of the receiving work, but that basically means I don't view him above Christian McCaffrey, Dalvin Cook, or Chris Carson for this week. But, I mean, it's really easy to like Josh Jacobs in a spot like this. It's always nice to see games where secondaries aren't super strong. And I think we get here, regardless of what the total is, we have two quarterbacks who aren't going to be flocked to by any means. Typically because they have the perception that they don't throw it deep, and we can basically dispel that. Derek Carr, very efficient on deep balls a year ago. He has some deep ball weapons. So I like this game a lot. I think there are just numerous plays. There are a lot of ways to stack it. That is a little bit problematic. I'm afraid of a Derek Carr stack because I don't know the proper I don't know who's going to get the majority of targets. That's a little bit scary. But I mean, everyone's kind of, their salaries are low enough to take some chances. So I'm very intrigued by this game. I just don't know what my priority way to stack it is.
I think that if you're concerned about target share at the Raiders, this is something I did a lot more last year with stacking quarterbacks, even with like rush heavy backs, like Russell Wilson and Chris Carson. I was okay with that because if Rashad Penny was out, I knew I was going to get almost every yard and probably every touchdown the Seahawks got. I think you're probably going to get that with the Raiders if you go Carr with Jacobs. So I think if you're worried, justifiably, about target shares, Carr Jacobs actually stands out pretty well. So I'm on board at that one. I think I have Henry Ruggs over Bryan Edwards. I know people are higher on Edwards, but it does sound like they are trying to use Henry Ruggs at every position, which to me says they are prioritizing him as being a focal point in the offense. I think Edwards is fine. He's cheaper, or he's lower salaried, I should say. So I think Edwards is fine, but I prefer Ruggs. So yes. If I'm ranking the candidates to stack on the Raiders side, I go Jacobs 1, actually. I know I don't have him as like my top running back or a top tier running back, but he's firmly second tier for me, in that same range as like Kamara and Mixon in them. I would go Ruggs 2, Waller 3, Edwards 4. On the Panthers side, it's Teddy and McCaffrey, like so easily. Like that's a money stack right there. I would go DJ Moore 2nd, Ian Thomas 3rd because of the salary, Robbie Anderson 4th, Curtis Samuel 5th. I know I listed a lot of names there, but what's your prioritization for these two stacks?
Yeah, like I said, it's tough for me. Would you go McCaffrey and Jacobs in the same lineup?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because McCaffrey's not dependent on game script. Actually, he might benefit if like they're throwing a bit more. So yeah, very much so.
Yeah, I'd be okay with that too. I think my preferred way to go might be Teddy, McCaffrey, Moore, Ruggs.
Okay.
Because I think that could work because Ruggs and Edwards both low salaried. I would even consider a Derek Carr, Ruggs, Edwards stack as well because the salaries there, and I think that anytime you get someone who can break a play like Henry Ruggs, it doesn't take too many targets.
Like right now, my default lineup does not have a Carr, Jacobs, Ruggs stack, but if I wind up there, I would not be that shocked. I would be fully in on that. We're going to take a look at what bookmakers are saying here in just 1 second. But first, week 1 is finally upon us, and FanDuel is back in 2020 with the Sunday Million contest once again. For just a $4 entry fee, yes, $4, compete to win over $3 million in total prizes, including a cool mill to first place. You can turn $4 into $1 million. Not too bad. Plus, if you roster the player who scores the first touchdown of the year, you will split a prize of $250,000 with everyone else who has that player on their roster. For more details, visit FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app today. Eligibility restrictions apply. Let's dive in here and see what bookmakers are saying about week number 1. The highest total on the slate was in the Superdome for the Saints and the Bucks, but that has come down 2 points to 47.5. This is Tom Brady's debut, but the reason that's going down is that Mike Evans is banged up and may not play. And it seems like there was money on the under even before the Evans injury. We had 78% of the bets at FanDuel Sportsbook were on the over, but just 40% of the money was. So people may have been into the under on this game even before the Evans injury. So now that we know that Evans is banged up, Brandon, how are you viewing this game between the Saints and the Bucks?
I don't hate it, but I definitely don't like it as much as I would assume everybody else would, or the general population will. Yeah. According to OddsFire, which you should definitely check out, this is the biggest discrepancy in money versus tickets. So basically, the biggest, the sharpest money that we see is on the under here. I'm inclined to agree with that. I look at this, like I broke down this game in my head and I wrote out my notes, and I like Chris Godwin. I'm going to talk about him more. But I don't really love too much else. I never am fully on board with playing quarterbacks who don't run, unless it's a spot where I feel super great about it or they are more affordable, lower salaried. So I think I'm with you. I think you thought maybe I would be on this, but I'm not.
Yeah, I think it's like the Evans injury hurts the appeal of this game. I know that that's like, we shouldn't overreact to one individual player in an NFL game, but when the Saints have done a good job against Chris Godwin and Mike Evans in the past, even when Marshawn Lattimore has missed games, like they've still done well against those two receivers specifically. And I think that that's a bit of a concern. Now you take potentially Mike Evans out of the equation, or at least put him in not full health. That concerns me on the Bucs side. And like, if there's a not 100% Mike Evans, that hurts Tom Brady, that hurts everyone in this offense. On the Saints side, I think that what I'm most inclined to do is try to find low salaried ways to get exposure to this team. Specifically, Jared Cook and Emmanuel Sanders, I think, are at least interesting. Cook got downfield targets last year. Sanders is low salaried, is tied to this game. That's a good thing. So I do like Kamara. I will state that again, despite the fact it's a really tough matchup. I think that matchups don't really matter for him. So I think that I like the Saints side an okay amount, but like not a ton. So I think we're kind of on the same page. We did a question on YouTube about the Buccaneers backfield. I am avoiding. I think like if they're going to split early down work between Fournette and Ronald Jones and then have LaShawn McCoy get third down work, I'm happy to avoid it. Are you in the same boat there?
Yeah. But there's no guarantee that any of the early down guys also get receiving work. It's not just the two of them, and it's kind of three backs. I'm fine missing out because I don't think that anyone is going to blow up unless someone gets handed like 3 touchdowns. I will say Chris Godwin was good against the Saints last year.
Yeah, I think
6 targets in one game, 47 yards and a touchdown, but 9 targets, 7 catches, 125 and 2. So
yeah. I think he had 15 Godwin. Total targets, and Evans had 11 in those 2 games.
Yeah, Evans had a 0-for-3 game.
That was the game that Lattimore played too. So
yeah,
slight concern there. I mean, Godwin, the issue. So like, I know the instinctive reaction to Mike Evans being banged up is, oh, I want to bump up Chris Godwin because of targets. But if they can't score as many touchdowns with Evans being potentially banged up, that hurts Chris Godwin too. So I might be weird in like that line of thinking, but that's where I do wind up there. Now alone at the top of the board from a total perspective is the Falcons against the Seahawks in Atlanta. This game has an even tighter spread at 1.5 points. It's also at 49.5. I do see a path to an under here. Only 33% of the money is on the over. And I actually recommended the under in this game on covering the spread yesterday. So like I do see a path to an under here. But despite that, I think it's a really fun game to stack because we know where the ball is going. Both teams seem a little bit lower salary than they should be. So where does this game sit on you from a stacking perspective?
This is a really easy one to like.
Agreed.
A lot of, I mean, you're not gonna go broke if you stack this game for the most part. So that's what makes it most enticing. I love stacks where you can just stack a lot of different ways, and that's what we get. Calvin Ridley 6,600. Say what you want about Todd Gurley, but he's 71. Hayden Hurst 52. Julio Jones 82. So he doesn't really fit into that, but both Seattle receivers are in the 6,000 range with DK Metcalf at 6,400, Tyler Lockett at 68. So it's a really easy game to like. As I said, I think for that reason, if I'm trying to be contrarian, I would be a little bit out on it. But from a process standpoint, it's a very good game stack.
No, I think that like you can make a case for Tyler Lockett being the best receiver on the slate from a salary perspective. He's $6,800, and if you look back at last year, before he had that leg injury, because like dude is legitimately in the hospital and like he didn't seem right for a bit after that, but before the injury, Lockett had 26% of the team's overall targets, 33% of the deep targets, and 29% of the red zone targets. The reason I like the Seahawks in general is that like not only do you know where the targets are going, but you know where the high leverage targets are going. They're going to Tyler Lockett, DK Metcalf, and middle fingers to everyone else. So I think that makes Lockett one of the best receivers on the slate. It makes me like Russell Wilson because he was also crazy efficient and he was aggressive. He was good on his deep throws before Lockett got hurt last year. So I think that Wilson is among the best quarterbacks in the slate. I think that Lockett is among the best receivers in the slate. I think that Carson is among the best running backs in the slate. So I like the Seahawks a lot, despite the fact that I do see a path to an under in this game. On the Falcons side, I agree with you. You mentioned Ridley. I think he's great. $6,600. He stacks really well with Chris Carson. Ridley last year in the games they played with Julio and Ridley and without Mohamed Sanu. It's a 5-game sample. Ridley actually had 38% of the team's deep targets in those games. Julio was at 44%, so Julio's worth his salary. But Ridley's at $6,600. I prefer him over Hayden Hurst as far as the stacking options within this game. How are you ranking the Falcons guys?
Ridley 1, Hurst 2, Julio 3 because of the salary.
I think that's where I'm at as well.
Although I will say in game stacks, I'm more inclined to just embrace more volatility and spend like pay for the higher salaried receivers.
Yes. Because if this game blows up, the odds that Julio Jones is not involved in it are low.
Yeah.
So I agree. I think that's a very fair way to look at it. We got a question on YouTube from King Paid about Todd Gurley. I'm not that high on Gurley because I want to see him get passing down work before I buy in. You sound like you might be higher on Gurley than I am, though.
Yeah, it's really difficult because you don't have to play Todd Gurley. There are much better process plays, but if you like this game and you think that the minimum 15 touches for Gurley is realistic, I don't think you can really talk yourself out of Todd Gurley. So I definitely don't have him as anything other than a game stack play. You have to.
I agree.
You have to think for Todd Gurley to be worth it. This is going to be a sort of a high scoring game, which again at 7,100, that salary is definitely affordable. So I mean, I'm not out on Todd Gurley. Are you out on Todd Gurley?
I agree with your assessment that he's game stacks only.
Yeah,
I think that's right. I'd agree with that. The highest implied total here is the Ravens. They are 7.5-point favorites at home against the Browns. Total here is 48.5. There is money on the under, but the spread is also tightened by a point since things open. So I am interested in some game stacks here. It's a really tough matchup for the Browns, but I think like they could overcome that. I love Marquise Brown. I think that there's some value in Odell Beckham and Jarvis Landry despite the matchup. Where do you sit on Browns versus Ravens?
I like this one. I think it might stick a little close just because I'm optimistic about the Browns, which is
It's
never
never gone
worked
wrong in
out
the past.
for
I'm the same way,
anybody.
though. I'm the same way.
I think Marquise Brown is obviously a really good tournament play, but until I see otherwise, I cannot trust Marquise Brown in anything resembling like a cash game.
No.
So the problem is Lamar Jackson is 9,400. That's a very high salary. I don't typically pay up for quarterback. Mark Andrews, 7,400 in terms of salary. I'm not fully against, paying a high salary for tight ends, but just doesn't really fit the go-to process for me. So the problem then becomes, if you're stacking this game, it's one of the quarterbacks, and it's either Baker, whose salary is 7,000, or Lamar at 94, and you kind of are locked into Mark Andrews and Marquise Brown. So I don't know. I'm high on it. I just don't really. I don't love how. And I guess it should be there's basically one way to stack it. It's a quarterback, the receivers, and Mark Andrews. So I
think that Marquise Brown in tournaments is really fun. I agree with you in cash games. In cash games, if you're in this range, you just go Desean Jackson. But there's also a lot of sentiment in favor of Desean Jackson. So for tournaments, there is a lot of incentive to go elsewhere. And Marquise Brown, I think, is the best pivot off of Desean Jackson in that same salary range. So that's why I think that I am very okay with going with Marquise Brown in tournaments under the assumption that Desean Jackson, I think this is the correct assumption, that Desean Jackson will be among the most popular players on the entire slate. So that's the reason I like that. Yeah, he will be. Tough matchup for the Browns, but I agree with you. I want to be high on them. Do you have a preference between Odell Beckham and Jarvis Landry?
Jarv's been good. He's been really underrated. He's been getting downfield work with the Browns. I still think I would go Odell in hopes that Odell is healthy, because Odell can do things that Jarvis Landry just can't really do. So
this will be a secondary game stack to me. I think that Panthers Raiders is a good one. And I would say that Seahawks Falcons is number 2. I think that the Bucks Saints game and the Ravens Browns game are kind of in the same tier to me, where it's a secondary game stack. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, it's not my favorite. So I think I'm with you. It's a little more restrictive because you either play Marquise Brown, who can get a 0, or you have to spend up at tight end for Mark Andrews, because there's really nobody else who's playable, at least entering week 1.
Boykin, baby.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's totally fine if you take a stand and say, hey, if Miles Boykin scores a touchdown, has anything else, that can definitely work out. But I'm still treating it as a secondary sort of stack.
All right, let's talk about another potential game stack here. It's another high total in San Francisco for the 49ers and the Cardinals. It is at 48.5 now after opening at 45.5. So this game has been boogieing up the board. But as mentioned before, we don't know if the 49ers will have Deebo Samuel or Brandon Ayuk, and that matters a lot to me. I think I'm lower on this game than consensus. Lower on Jimmy Garoppolo than consensus. What about you?
Yeah, I think Garoppolo is a good enough season-long play, because I like the matchup and the pace. And really, he was good last year without super consistent targets, and he still has George Kittle. So I'm not overly concerned from a season-long standpoint, but this is not what we're talking about. And I don't think I have to really force this. I like Kenyon Drake in this game a lot, despite the matchup. I like George Kittle a ton, but I rarely spend, 8,000 for a tight end. So it's a little difficult to stack. I'm not touching the 49ers backfield.
No,
I'm not going to be
tempted
by any
incentive
value
too, because they're so efficient and the Cardinals defense isn't that great. So there is incentive to do so, but they're not going to get targets. They're going to be spread out touches. So I agree. I think we might not be fully in step with the public on that, but I'm okay being lower on them than the public. George Kittle, I think, is good. The one concern that is present is that Isaiah Simmons is now there, and we don't talk a lot about defensive players on here, but like Isaiah Simmons is not a defensive player. He's like more of a deity than a defensive player. And like they could be really good against tight ends this year. So that might concern me for Kittle. And like if Isaiah Simmons can do well against Kittle, they can use him in like Budda Baker or whatever to like neutralize George Kittle. Like where is Jimmy Garoppolo going to throw the football? So that's why I'm lower on Garoppolo. I don't think I'll have Garoppolo in my player pool as of right now, even though he's facing a high-paced team that can, that it doesn't have a great defense. But I think that we're on the same page here where I think that actually Christian Kirk is also interesting as a pivot off of Desean Jackson. He has a built-in chemistry with Kyler Murray from last year. DeAndre Hopkins kind of wasn't practicing until he got his contract. So I think there might be kind of a pause in DeAndre Hopkins going off. So Christian Kirk at $5,800 makes sense. I agree with Kenyon Drake. If you want to have some fun, Dan Arnold, don't listen to me on that. That's just me hoping. But I think that I agree. I'm a little bit lower on San Francisco. Weather for this week. There is actually, before we do that, can you rank the game stacks for me?
I was not prepared for this and I should have been.
I know. Why would I make you prepare when I can put you on the spot instead?
Probably Seattle, Atlanta. Vegas, Carolina.
I had those two flip-flopped, but yes, and 1-2 there.
And then third, it might be because of my concerns about the New Orleans game and the 49ers offense, it might be actually Baltimore or Cleveland.
So I'm going to flip-flop the ones you had. I have Vegas, Carolina 1. I have Seattle, Atlanta 2. I have Bucs, Saints still 3. And then I'll go Ravens, Browns 4. But we're on the same page there. And I think that hopefully that's different than the crowd. And I think it might be based on the read I've gotten with that 49ers game specifically. Weather for this weekend, there is a chance of rain in New England for the Patriots and the Dolphins. Wind speeds are only 5 miles per hour, though, so they should be fine. In general, our line of thought with weather is, maybe this is just me, rain is fine as long as it's not a monsoon. And the thing that matters way more is wind. Once it gets to 10 miles per hour or higher, I start to get very nervous. So wind speeds 5 miles per hour, that game's fine. Winds are higher, though, in Buffalo for the Bills and the Jets, currently sitting at 12 miles per hour. At least Josh Allen's accurate. There is a slight chance of rain, but the wind would be the bigger concern for me there. We have not talked about the Bills. No. Are you going at Smokey or Stephon Diggs?
I think a Josh Allen Diggs stack is totally viable because it can be one of those where it's like, well, I mean, Stephon Diggs went for like 130 yards and 2 touchdowns. That's what he can do. Josh Allen can sling it. I think that kind of takeaway at the end of Sunday evening is more realistic than the stack will probably be rostered on FanDuel. So I think for that reason, it makes sense. But outside of that, I'm just low on that game.
I actually still like John Brown just because he has, like we talked about before with like DeAndre Hopkins, he has a built-in chemistry with Josh Allen. I think that might be valuable early on. So I don't mind John Brown.
Receivers who change teams typically underperform for the full season. So
yeah, so I'll have some John Brown, but if the wind stays high, I'm okay dumping out of that. Another slight chance of rain in Baltimore for the Browns and the Ravens, but the wind speeds are low, so not a game that concerns me. Same thing in Washington. As the Eagles as Washington hosts the Eagles, and also in Jacksonville as they host the Colts. So Washington, Philadelphia, Jacksonville, and Indy all have a chance of rain, but not wind. So I think those games are fine. This is a pretty clean weather week for me. The Bills-Jets game is the only one where I'm really considering the weather at all, although other ones should be good to go. So let's dive into our positional plays for week number 1 on FanDuel. Brandon, starting off with you at quarterback, who are you targeting there?
I mean, I love Lamar and I love Russell Wilson, but I think one name we haven't discussed, I think, is Carson Wentz. I know he's not even 100%, and I certainly know his offense is not 100%, but against Washington at 7,700, I think that with 2 clear options in Desean Jackson and Zach Ertz, and you can maybe lump in Dallas Goddard there, I still think it's a good spot. Usually when quarterbacks have problems with pass catchers, like we talked about with Garoppolo, I worry, but Washington does not worry me a ton, especially with like Desean Jackson doing what I think it was Kevin Cole did a study on Desean Jackson and his impact on the field. Like Desean Jackson makes quarterbacks significantly better. So I love that for Wentz. And if Miles Sanders isn't 100%, maybe there's a little more passing work involved. And he put up 21 FanDuel points or more in each game against Washington last season. Pro Football Focus ranks Washington's secondary 28th entering the season. So Carson Wentz, from like a cash game standpoint, I think has a high floor and a solid ceiling. But I also like Teddy Bridgewater plenty at 6,800. Going to take a chance here. He didn't throw downfield often in 2019, but was efficient on passes traveling at least 16 yards downfield. He was as efficient as Kyler Murray and Deshaun Watson on deep attempts. He is a big boost to the offense from Kyle Allen. So Bridgewater with DJ Moore, Robbie Anderson, Curtis Samuel, Ian Thomas, Christian McCaffrey. Like we talked about this game for the salary. I like Teddy a lot, and I would even consider just plugging him in a single lineup. So I have a lot of flexibility elsewhere.
Yeah, I like Teddy too. With Wentz, I'll be higher if Jalen Reagor finds a way to play, because that would give him two legitimate receivers as opposed to one. So I will keep an eye on
Dallas Goddard.
I mean, they can't get downfield though, so are they really legitimate? I would be higher on him if Reagor can play.
Yeah,
I don't tend to use Carson Wentz that often though.
Yeah, I don't either. But I was like, I mean, even with everything, I still think he's in a good spot.
Fair enough. My first quarterback here is Russell Wilson. I know this is very bold of me, but I love Russ. Week 1 is a great time to play the assumption game. Another thing we'll say here often on the podcast, the assumption game is where you make assumptions and build lineups as if that assumption is 100% going to happen. And if we assume that the Seahawks let Russ cook, he could go nuts here. The Falcons were 25th against the pass last year. They'll likely have a lot of youth at cornerback for this year. Before Tyler Lockett's injury last year, Russ is averaging 0.32 passing net expected points per dropback. That is like elite tier stuff. He struggled after Lockett got hurt, but now Lockett is healthy and Russ gets to play indoors, and there's the potential for him to throw a bit more. So I love Russell Wilson as a quarterback play in week 1. My second love is Derek Carr, because Carr is boring, and I love that. Before last night, he had 0 tags on FanShare, and he only has a tag because I tweeted about how he had no tags. So he's never – last year, he never scored more than 23.4 FanDuel points in a game. But this is different. Not only does he have new weapons, but he's facing a crazy young defense and potentially an up-tempo offense. Like, situation matters a lot. Not only does he get a better situation, but this matchup may be the best matchup that any quarterback can possibly have right now. I think the Panthers could be that. I think the Panthers and Rams are going to be over machines early in the year. The Rams are not on the main slate. Panthers are. So I want to target them here. Carr, his situation has changed drastically, and I want to account for those changes and plug him in this week. Let's move to running back. Brandon, who are you targeting there?
I'm going to go with Dalvin Cook at 8,700. Cash game option, cash game pretty much lock for me. This shouldn't be a blowout. In 2019, he had one game with single-digit FanDuel points. Green Bay was 31st against the rush last season. I have him projected for the most adjusted opportunities among all main slate running backs not named Christian McCaffrey. My second love is Joe Mixon at 73. Mixon is 4th for me in projected adjusted opportunities as a pretty big discount from the other guys.
Who is 3rd out of curiosity?
Let me look.
Be Kamara?
I think it was Kamara.
Okay, cool. That makes sense.
Where was I?
Sorry.
7 games with at least 60% of snaps in 2019, but in them 15.1 FanDuel points in a much worse situation than what we'll probably have this year. Didn't have a big ceiling, but down the stretch actually kind of did perform way above his offense's expectations with multiple 17-point games or more. I don't love the matchup specifically because the Chargers have a really good secondary, but it's possible Mixon gets leaned on a little bit more in Joe Burrow's first start. And then my third love is Kenyon Drake, whose salary is 6,600. He is 7th for me in adjusted opportunities. I like Miles Sanders, but I don't really know what he's going to have in terms of workload. So I would feel more comfortable playing Kenyon Drake. Drake does have a tough matchup with the 49ers, but he had 11 and 26.2 FanDuel points against them last year. He averaged a 79% snap rate with the Cardinals, 24 adjusted opportunities per game. He's probably that's the lowest salary I think I would go with in a cash game build, unless I talk myself into Antonio Gibson, which I probably won't.
Yeah, I will. But I think Kenyon Drake, I think Drake and Mixon, like you said, both are in tough matchups. But the good thing with Mixon, I guess, is that Derwin James is out. I still worry about Burrow because the cornerbacks there are so good. But I think that Mixon benefits more from Derwin James being out. So I think that Mixon's a good option too. And I think that he is in that second tier along with guys like Austin Eckler in that same game. And then Kenyon Drake will be there too.
Then outside of McCaffrey, Cook, and Carson, who do you put fourth? Gibson?
No. Probably Josh Jacobs. It's between Jacobs, Mixon, and Eckler. I think those are the three I would consider for that fourth slot. What about you?
I would go Mixon, Drake.
Oh, I forgot Kamara.
Yeah, I'm not.
I might actually go Kamara despite the matchup just because the targets are going to be there. I'm going to go Kamara 4, actually.
Okay.
I thought you were going to say more.
No, I mean, okay. I said mine.
Okay.
Yeah, I like the savings for Mixon.
Yep. So my first receiver, well, kind of receiver, Christian McCaffrey, pretty easy one, but whatever, we're giving out picks. Even before the Panthers started chasing the records last year, McCaffrey averaged 33.6 adjusted opportunities per game last year. Now, better quarterback play to jack up his touchdown potential, $10,000. But honestly, in week one, salaries are kind of fake because everyone's so cheap. So who cares? You can jam him in, and you should. I like Chris Carson. I like everyone above this salary range too, but Carson I think is worth highlighting because he played 7 games last year without Rashad Penny, 27.7 adjusted opportunities per game in that time. You're getting that against the Falcons, whose defense is not great, despite the addition of Dante Fowler. So I think that Carson, what you're getting, at least for right now, is a discount workhorse, and I will happily buy into that, similar to what you said with Joe Mixon, and I agree with what you said about Mixon as well. My third love will be Antonio Gibson, because if I'm going to buy into any of the rookie running backs, it will be Gibson, and that's because of the kinds of touches he's likely to get, and those are creative ones. Offensive coordinator Scott Turner likes his running backs to be able to split out wide, get work as both rushers and receivers. We've heard, literally Ron Rivera compared him to Christian McCaffrey, and I think that's way too optimistic. But I would not be shocked to see Gibson have an Austin Eckler type role potentially early in the season too. And I'm not going to have more of him than I have McCaffrey, Dalvin, and Carson, but among the lower salaried options, he does stand out to me for those higher leverage looks. We've not mentioned James White's name. I want to physically say his name on this podcast because we were talking about snap rates for lower salary backs. I think if you're projecting snap rates for any of them, you have to have the highest projected snap rate for James White just because Sonny Michel's banged up, Damian Harris on injured reserve, Rex Burkhead is Rex Burkhead, and then I kind of like the Patriots offense to be decent in this game. So James White at 53, I would rank Gibson above him, but I'm not going to rule out James White. I know you don't like James White, so I'm not going to make you talk about him, but just throwing that out there.
Yeah, I'm not going to use him. With week one, I pretty much am okay with anybody rostering anybody where they see it. So I'm not. I don't think I'll regret not drafting.
Fair enough.
James White. Fair enough.
What do you have at wide receiver?
Wide receiver is tough because there are a lot of really good plays. I think
they're all good.
I have Chris Godwin here. I might sort of revise it depending on the Mike Evans situation, but I still think Godwin's kind of in play regardless. At a salary of $7,700, 10 catches on 15 targets for 172 yards and 3 touchdowns last year against New Orleans. I don't just copy and paste that, but it was definitely intriguing. Mike Evans, of course, not 100%. I really want Mike Evans to play. This is not a situation where I'm more inclined to chase the targets without Evans than I am to chase Godwin's usual targets with Mike Evans playing and stretching the field. But I still think Godwin's a little bit more of a tournament pick because the running backs at similar prices or similar salaries have higher floors. If you want to go like Gibson and maybe like Drake or just Drake and you kind of have enough to get into the 7,000s. I like Godwin, but I also like DJ Moore. I just think there are a lot of ways to go, but I think Chris Godwin could easily lead week one in targets. My second love it's tough because like we talked about Tyler Lockett, DK Metcalf, Calvin Ridley already, but DJ Chark is a name we kind of just glossed over. His salary is $6,600. I have him projected for just above 8 targets to rank him 12th on the main slate per dollar. He's 7th. Last year, 20% of targets from Minshew, which I don't love, but there's going to be volume here because I would have to assume the Colts do get out ahead on the Jaguars. And with the backfield situation, I mean, Chris Thompson can get targets, but I would have to think a lot of volume goes to DJ Chark. So Chark is really interesting to me as one of those more non-obvious plays. Again, I would prefer Calvin Ridley, DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett.
If you had to pick one in the 6,000 range.
That's so tough.
I know. That's why I'm asking you. Because I don't know, so I'm asking you. Pick for me.
I mean, Terry McLaurin's there in a similar logic to play as DJ Chark, but it might be Tyler Lockett.
We have not mentioned Adam Thielen's name. He's $6,800 and will probably get 16 targets. So it's between Lockett, Thielen, and Ridley for me. Julian Edelman will probably get 16 targets too, and he's 67,
I think Ridley's up there.
Yeah.
But this is kind of what we see week in, week out, wide receiver. And it's another reason why I feel comfortable. Okay, so I can't roster Michael Thomas. Maybe I can't even roster, Chris Godwin.
Sure.
There are targets to be had here.
Yeah.
And another player who should get targets, I know there's Desean Jackson, Marquise Brown. I don't want to talk about the same guys all the time, but I like Preston Williams a lot at 5,300. He rates out for me as the best per dollar target value in terms of projections and what should be like a catch-up game for Miami. I think we're probably both okay stacking this game up a little bit. I think we're both like New England's offense. But Preston Williams actually out-targeted Devontae Parker through week 9 until Williams was hurt. I don't know if that'll stick, but we're getting a lot of targets probably for Preston Williams for a salary of $5,300.
He had 34% of the deep targets before the injury and 37% of the red zone targets. Like, I know the matchup is really tough, but that's considerable volume.
And there's really nothing behind Parker, Williams, and Mike Gesicki.
Whoa, Lynn Bowden, baby.
There's
wide receiver Lynn Bowden making a position change with 1 week before the season. What could go wrong? And changing teams.
Yeah.
I'm not as high on Williams because of the matchup, but I understand the logic, and I think it makes sense. My first 11 receiver is Devonte Adams. Shocker, if I'm splurging for a higher salary receiver, Adams will be at the top of my list because in the games he played last year, Devonte had 30% of the overall targets, 30% of the deep targets, and 40% of the red zone targets. Facing a Vikings secondary that has a lot of inexperience at corner. They're also indoors. And Adams is $8,000. I actually think that salary is lower than it should be. So Devonte Adams, if I'm spending up, will be the target. In the mid-range, I like Marquise Brown a lot. It seems like, again, Desean Jackson's going to be mega chalk. So I want to find players near him in salary who can serve as pivots. In a cash game, you use Desean Jackson because he's going to get a lot of targets, 57. However, for tournaments, I want to pivot and I want to go Marquise Brown at $5,900. He was kept in check most of last year because his injuries and the game script, but now he's healthy. We don't know what the script will look like. And in their playoff loss, they took the leash off of Brown. He had 11 targets and 178 air yards. Both those were most in the team by a wide margin. If we assume the snap rate goes up on Marquise Brown, he could blow up. So I'll take a stand on him at $5,900 as a Desean Jackson pivot. I would also mention T.Y. Hilton as being kind of interesting. I know we're mentioning every $6,000 receiver, but he's $6,400. And I think that Phillip Rivers is going to be better than expectation this year. And I think the Jags defense is going to be pure trash. So I will say T.Y. Hilton will be in my player pool.
Yeah, Christian Kirk.
Yeah.
Manny Sanders.
Anthony Miller. Let's talk about Anthony Miller here for a second. I adore Henry Ruggs. I like Bryan Edwards, and they're good. But I've talked enough about the Raiders, so let's talk about Anthony Miller because, hey, he's playing in a dome. Domes are great. There's no wind in domes. There's no rain in domes. Domes are great. Allen Robinson will see the tougher coverage here. I'd assume that Jeffrey Okudah will be probably stalking him throughout the day. If we look at weeks 13 to 16 last year, when Taylor Gabriel was out and before Anthony Miller got hurt in week 17, He had 22% of the team's targets, 36% of the deep targets, and 22% of the red zone targets. So I've heard some buzz around Mitchell Trubisky. I'm not there personally, but I can go at Anthony Miller at $5,400. If I'm picking, let's pick someone below $5,500. I'll pick first.
Chris Conley.
I didn't, what?
Chris Conley.
No. Someone below $5,500. I didn't prepare you for this, so I'll go first. I kind of think it would be Anthony Miller because I can most reasonably project him to have a good target load. I would go Henry Ruggs second. What about you?
Ruggs.
Okay.
Williams.
Okay.
Miller.
Perfect. Let's move on to tight end then. Who do you have there?
I have Zach Ertz. I don't hate the idea of paying George Kittle $8,000 to be on my team, but realistically, I'm not going to get there often. I don't think you can project many, if any, tight ends for more targets, especially per dollar than Ertz, even at a salary of $6,600. Given all of the injuries for Philadelphia, it's not really that bad of a salary for a tight end who is not just another tight end. He caught 10 of 17 targets last year against Washington, 115 yards and a touchdown. I feel really good about a volume projection for Zach Ertz. I also feel the same about Hayden Hurst for a salary of $5,200. He's not someone I targeted in the offseason, but Austin Hooper vacates a lot of targets and a pretty relevant role for $5,200. That's enticing. When healthy, Austin Hooper had 19% of the targets, 7.5 per game in 2019. Scale that back even a bit. In this game environment, Hurst, I know, is a popular pick on FanShare already, but I could see just playing Hayden Hurst in a cash game and trying to, maximize my the investment in tight end, which is always pretty volatile.
Yeah, I think that Hurst is low salary exposure to a game we want to stack, and that's always valuable, which is the same reason I like Jared Cook, who is my first love at tight end, because Emmanuel Sanders and Jared Cook both check that box where they're low salaried exposure to that game. Cook was hurt for a lot of last year, actually 2 separate times, but when he was healthy, he got downfield looks and he did convert those into yards. He had 80 or more yards 3 times in 14 games. We don't see a lot of yardage totals out of tight ends, but that's how you get floor and a ceiling. That's a lot of upside for someone at $5,900. So Jared Cook is someone I like a lot. For Sunday, I also love Dallas Goddard in that same game before, as you mentioned, Zach Ertz. I think that the logic is the same on both them. They're going to get targets. It's another way to pivot off of Desean Jackson being the chalk. Goddard and Ertz played 4 games after the bye last year with Alshon Jeffrey out. In those 4 games, Goddard actually had a 20% target share with 24% of the deep targets. It's only $5,200. So probably not the highest upside guy. We did have at least 65 yards 5 times last year. So I think that Goddard at 52 is intriguing. There are some decent tight ends in this slate. I will say that. There are decent ways to spend down. So although I like George Kittle and I like Mark Andrews and all those guys, the low salary guys do help quite a bit. Let's finish up here with defense, our favorite position. What you got, Brandon?
I'm real bad. I feel like I'm bad at defense.
Everyone's bad at defense. That's the key.
Yeah, I usually just try not to invest a lot of the salary cap. So I like Detroit, 3,700, 3-point favorites against Mitchell Trubisky, I should say. I like the Bears' weapons fine. Anthony Miller, we both like. Jeffrey Okudah, Desmond Trufant could be problematic enough. Trubisky historically has actually done well against the Lions, but look, if I can't pick your pick, I'm going to just pick the Lions against Trubisky, I think. Yeah,
Trubisky has always had fairly concerning home road splits, and that's a good thing for the Lions defense. So I think they work. I like the Colts a lot at $3,700 because they're facing the Jaguars, who are tanking, it seems like. So $3,700 for a team that is facing a team that's tanking, that's good. I also would say, as a contrarian play, the Chargers, despite not having Derwin James, because the only flaw in Joe Burrow's game in college was taking sacks. He's got a really bad offensive line against Joey Bosa. So I think that the Chargers, from a tournament perspective, are actually pretty interesting, but I would say the Lions and Colts, if you're trying to spend down, which you should, are the optimal ways to do so. Brandon, that's all we got for today. Any final thoughts for you on this Week 1 main slate?
I mean, that's all. I feel like we covered everything. Maybe not everything.
Let me think here.
There was a game we didn't really talk about. I know
The Bills and the Jets?
we talked about not talking about the Bills and the Jets, but
there's a reason.
There was some maybe
Herndon?
Chicago, Detroit.
Oh yeah, we talked about Anthony Miller. We talked about
we talked about Galladay, Marv, Stafford. We can't talk about everybody in detail.
So I would have talked about Marv, but the problem is he's in the range with all the good receivers, and I don't like him as much as them. So
yeah, but like I think that's a perfect example. If you're just consuming content, whether it's podcasts, videos, articles, and you're like, nobody's talking about Kenny Galladay and like Matthew Stafford and Marvin Jones and Allen Robinson, like there's no reason those guys can't go off in week 1. So I think that's like my biggest takeaway.
It's also in a dome, which helps. So yeah, I think that makes sense. I will not be.
We don't know anything.
Yeah, we know nothing. That's kind of the key thing is we know nothing. Just your exposures, to account for that. But also just like have some fun. Go build some lineups, enjoy it because football is back. Have some fun, get those lineups in, sit back, enjoy the games, and hopefully things break in your favor. That is all the time that we have for today. Do not forget to subscribe to the numberFire Daily Fantasy Podcast feed. Again, 2 NFL podcasts per week. On Monday and on Thursday, the recap podcast coming back on Monday, which will be the most important podcast we record this entire year. Given all the uncertainty heading into week 1, there will be a lot of big takeaways. So make sure you check that out, whether on the DFS feed or on the FanDuel YouTube page at 9 a.m. Also, we are back on YouTube, Twitch, and Facebook on Friday at 3:30 p.m. Eastern, doing a snake draft with me, Brandon, and JJ Zacharyson. So make sure you check that out there. We'll also probably answer questions depending on how much time is left after the snake draft is done. If you have questions for Brandon, people, oh my goodness, the subjects of that sentence were a train wreck. Brandon, if people have questions for you on Twitter, where can they find you there? Oof.
I'm at Gadula13, GDULA13.
And I am at Jim Sannes, JIMSANNES. You can also follow the FanDuel Podcast Network at FanDuel Podcast. Big thank you to Calvin Theobald, our video producer from the video side of things here today. Thank you, Cal, as always. And thank you to everyone for tuning in. Good luck with your NFL DFS lineups in week 1. Enjoy the football. And we'll talk to you again on Monday to wrap it all up. This has been the Heat Check Fantasy Podcast powered by numberFire.